Paul Phoenix. A capricious vagabond, a prolific fighter, arguably one of the most acclaimed competitors to ever take part in the King of Iron Fist tournament. And somehow, despite his numerous monumental feats, he is also absurdly known as comic relief. Now, the story of Paul is one that has its fair share of peaks and valleys. But did Paul get a fair shake in the series before being relegated to the Phantom Zone? That is the sea of non-canonicity. Let's take a look. The year was 1994. Paul Phoenix was in his 20s and kept himself occupied competing in illegal street fights and part-time work as a bouncer. Paul already had his heart set on being the toughest fighter in the universe at this time. To this end, Paul studied alongside Li Shaolan and martial law, as prevailing wisdom dictates that iron sharpens iron. He would get his opportunity to realize his dream when the first ever King of Iron Fist tournament was announced. The contest began, and though this was a relatively green Paul Phoenix, remarkably, no one was able to defeat him. He blasted his way through every single competitor with relative ease. Mind you, from this inaugural occurrence of the event, it was clear that this was one of the most brutal fighting contests around, as there were no divisions or weight classes. Weapons were permitted, as well as cyborgs and deadly animals were also able to compete, such as Kuma. This marked the first meeting between Paul and Kuma. Stunningly, Paul was able to defeat Kuma, a literal Japanese brown bear trained in martial arts. Paul then inexorably crossed paths with Kazuya Mishima. These two pugilistic paragons engaged and fiercely fought one another to a standstill, resulting in a tie. Now, the rules of Tekken are unclear about what transpires when a draw occurs, but it would appear that someone who has bloodline relations with the Mishimas are given special privilege, and as a result, Kazuya advanced and claimed victory in the final round over Heihachi. The Mishima Zaibatsu flourished under Kazuya, mostly through ill-gotten gains, and we would see the trend of corruption start to become a prominent theme of the tournament sponsors hereafter. Regarding Paul, the first tournament gave birth to two unrequited rivalries, in the shape of Paul now considering Kazuya a rival, and Kuma now likewise feeling the same about Paul. We would have to wait 2 years for the next tournament to be held. Paul remained steadfast in his ambition and trained hard alongside martial law, who grew to be Paul's best friend. The fire within Paul to be the best burned even brighter than before, and in addition, Paul now had his eyes set on besting the only competitor to ever prove to be his equal. His sentiments were somewhat mirrored in Kuma, who also retreated to the dojo to improve and take Paul down in the upcoming tournament. The day of the King of Iron Fist Tournament 2 rolls by, and this is where we started to see the level of competition rise steeply, as once again the tournament permitted weapons, and as before, entry was open to highly trained martial artists as well as robots and deadly animals. In addition, we now also have supernatural beings and dinosaurs vying for the championship. Despite all of this, Paul proves to be as prolific as he was in the first, perhaps even more so, as evidenced by him making his way past all of these new threats and besting Kuma a second time without issue. Despite Kuma himself being much more adept this time around, Paul once again advanced to the later rounds and was set to face his rival. This was it. This was his chance to run it back with Kazuya and right the wrong of the first tournament. But once again, controversy reared its ugly head. Paul would again be denied, this time by none other than Japanese highway traffic. As Paul could not make it to the bout, he was required to forfeit. In steps Heihachi, who faces off with Kazuya in the final and claims victory along with reclaiming the Mishima Zaibatsu. Astonishingly, 2 decades went by before invitations were handed out for the third tournament. Paul entered without a second thought. A lot changed in the 20 years that passed. There were many new faces in the tournament. Kazuya was nowhere to be found. Kuma sadly passed away, but not before ensuring that his offspring would be trained and taken in by Heihachi and continue his dream of defeating Paul in combat. Perhaps the most shocking news of all, despite Paul being much older, he reached a new level. Once again systematically shutting down opponents, now in devastating fashion. Blasting through Kuma Jr. just as easily as he did his father. Reaching the finals and facing a creature literally known as the god of fighting, Ogre. He didn't get to settle things with Kazuya, but he was undeterred. His goal remained unchanged, to be the only one left standing and to be crowned champion. He did it. He defeated Ogre. There was nobody left. All who would stand in his way were defeated. He was the champion. Or was he? Sometime after being defeated by Paul, Ogre mutated into his true beastly form. Out of nowhere, Jin steps in and defeats what is left of Ogre to be crowned the champion. Yet again, Paul had been cheated. Paul was lambasted for claiming to be the champion of the third tournament. He lost standing among his students, as everyone saw Jin defeat True Ogre. Consequently, his dojo was on the brink of going out of business. This was Paul at his lowest. The fourth tournament comes around, and Paul sees it as a chance to clean himself up and rebound. Phoenix extemporaneously signs up, and this is where we start to see Paul finally look every bit of a human. He was unceremoniously eliminated by none other than Kuma. From here on out, Phoenix's performances in the tournaments stood in stark contrast to the Paul everyone was used to seeing in the first 3 tournaments. The man who never seemed to stop improving, the only fighter to have an official undefeated record for 3 tournaments straight. The man who punched his way through a literal demigod, the untouchable Paul. But was Paul's fall from grace due to his own missteps? And if it isn't, could things have played out differently? Let's take a deeper look into this. When it comes to the subject of analyzing Paul's true potential, the answer seems to lie more in timing, location, and opportunity. What does this mean? Well, Paul's potential in canon Tekken timeline hasn't really been downplayed or concealed, but the heights that he could have reached in the series were not realized due to the nature of how Tekken tournaments usually play out. There's no way to sugarcoat it. Tekken is one of the most corrupt combat sport events ever to exist in fighting games. That's saying a lot when one considers the alternatives. But the main issue in the Tekken universe is that the light is rarely shined on anyone outside of the Mishima family. The rules seem to be malleable. Meritocracy often takes a backseat and is disregarded. All the benefactors declare themselves the victors. To this end, I believe Paul would have had much more success if he competed elsewhere. Now, we are about to break the universal wall here, if you will, but hear me out. Let's remind ourselves that Paul is a human with the power to do this.
Final round. Fight. Perfect.
Paul has proven himself to be able to defeat gods and animals capable of literally ripping regular human beings to shreds. And remember, we are talking about an older Paul here. So, just imagine what Paul would have been capable of during that long 20-year hiatus between Tekken 2 and 3. Honestly, I think he does very well if he competed in Street Fighter, Dead or Alive, or even Mortal Kombat. Granted, these tournaments too have their fair share of controversy. Human characters like Liu Kang have great success, but so do powerful characters like Raiden and even Shao Kahn. The point being, if you win in Mortal Kombat, you are the victor. No questions asked. Of course, there are always plots in the background, but the rules are respected by all who enter. A similar theme of respecting tournament structure is prevalent in Dead or Alive as well as in Street Fighter. In these kinds of impartial environments is where I feel we would possibly see the best of Paul Phoenix. He clearly has the strength and technique to hold his own against characters who are nigh supernatural, and it was only when he clearly was out of his prime that we ever really saw him start to slow down. Imagine what a young and hungry fighter with a 3-tournament undefeated record and the power to one-shot most of the roster would be able to achieve in the aforementioned tournaments. Paul's personality seems to embody Bushido ideology. For this reason, it's hard to see him ever turn into someone who would abandon their competitive nature to prove a point. But if Paul were the type to doggedly pursue his perceived rivalry with Kazuya, as Warren did with Jin, I believe he would have had a chance at attaining success in the Tekken tournament, and here's why. During the first tournaments, Paul must have encountered at least one of Kazuya's bodyguards, which included the likes of Bruce and Ganryu in Tekken 2, in Tekken 5. He crossed paths with the likes of Raven and members of the G Corporation, who would later be recruited by Kazuya, such as Anna. Nina was recruited by Jin after the 5th tournament, and could also have brought in Paul to assist in fighting against Heihachi and Kazuya. Alternatively, if he pressed these combatants to aid him in pursuing Kazuya, it's more than likely he would have eventually landed in Kazuya's sights before long, and become ensnared in the dark web of the Mishimas. By proxy, allowing him to be taken seriously and viewed as a threat. Again, not unlike how Hwoarang was able to assert himself with Jin and actually manage to defeat him. So, it would seem that Paul was closer to the Mishimas than he thought, as he also trained with Li Shaolan, leading up to the second tournament. Being so close to Shaolan at this time, I doubt it would have taken long for Paul to ascertain Li's motive for entering the tournament. Now that we know there was no shortage of opportunity for Paul to close in on Kazuya, personally, I do believe that the Mishimas, especially post Tekken 4, would prove to be too much for Paul, and Kazuya would more than likely have shown the gap between himself and Phoenix if Paul were to face him in his devil form. In short, it seems inevitable that Paul would not have been able to compete with the main players. That is, if he was not prepared to get his hands a little dirty, either by pursuing cybernetic augmentation like Brian, or opting for cryostasis as Nina did in order to prolong his fighting prime. As the saying goes, you don't get to look the devil in the eyes without taking a ride to the bottom floor. In essence, Paul would have to become just as corrupt as the Mishimas in order to establish himself in the Tekken universe. This goes against the free-spirited, venerable, hardworking and competitive nature of Paul that is his core character. However, this is still a path worth mentioning, as it could quite plausibly occur if circumstances were to change in the future. Let's not forget that Jin himself became corrupted when he got involved with Kazuya and Heihachi. He isn't what he once was, but Paul is still far from being a pushover. Were it not for the Mishimas, it's hard to see many of the cast being able to beat him on his best day, let alone being able to take his burning fist and live to tell the tale.
Paul! Hey, Paul! Paul!
Phoenix has become one of the most beloved characters in the series, evidenced by the fact that he often ranks highly in fan polls and is the choice of many players in FGC tournaments. For these reasons, it's hard to see Paul as anything less than an uncrowned champion. He never really had the chance to claim the title of being the king of the Iron Fist tournament yet. But with the 7th installment officially heralding the conclusion of the Mishima saga, there is hope that the people's champion may yet claim the glory he so rightfully deserves.